Everybody. Thank you for coming today. We have a very serious topic, but we will try to cover it with lots of interest, and hopefully you have lots of questions so that it doesn't just get dry and depressing. Anybody with cattle knows that disease is a possibility and it can be really scary. So we narrowed it down to 10 of the main diseases that we might deal with when we're talking about a homestead. This is presented by PMJS. If you're not familiar, we are the Purebred Mini Jersey Society. What makes us a little different is that our cattle are registered that requires a DNA test that tells you the purity, the amount of Jersey DNA that's actually in your miniature Jersey. So that we are breeding miniaturized Jerseys that have all those traits that we just love about Jerseys, those big doe eyes, but also all those really strong dairy traits. When you cross a dairy breed with a beef breed, which is really common, you destroy that and you end up with kind of a cross, and you don't really know what you're getting. So when we test for that DNA, we know that we have a certain amount of Jersey, and we can compound that with intentional breeding. And that's what PMJS is really all about, making sure that we're breeding miniaturized Jerseys so we can all get those great traits that we're after, that we just love in our Jerseys. I am known on Facebook and social media as Milkmaid Lorinda, and that was a name given to me by one of my husband's commanders when he was active duty Army, because they knew nobody else who had dairy cows and was active duty Army. It was pretty rare to have something like that. But we wanted to start when we had a bit of a safety net and decide what kind of animals we liked having on our homestead. So we started with dairy cows about 13 years ago. I really enjoyed having the calves and learning to milk and bringing the milk. I still feel like a hero when I bring milk into the house for the family. It's still really exciting for me, even after all this time. So that never went away. And I love being able to talk to people and share why we're doing this and why it's important to us. Because we are covering a lot of topics today that are about healthcare, human and our livestock. I want to make sure that everybody understands that I am not a veterinarian. I'm not a doctor. I don't have any training in those specific areas. The information that's being shared is all found online. There's nothing here that was just random. We do have links that are shared in the slides so that you can go and you can do further research and read the rest of that information. If you do find yourself having some issues with some of these diseases, or possibly an animal that's sick that needs some testing, I strongly recommend that you contact your veterinarian and get them looped in and get some help with what further testing to do, what's maybe endemic in your area, because it really has to do with weather for a lot of these things. If it's really warm and moist, it's going to have a lot more problems than where I am north in Idaho. We are very cold, and so a lot of things don't live very long outside of the animal. You can also call the lab director for a lot of these places where you're going to get testing. And they've been very helpful for me when I've had questions about, I have a lot of people that call me and they'll say that they have an animal that's positive and what do they do? And so I can call and I can talk to that lab and find out what tests they did. And if they feel that that's a very positive, or if they want to retest in a certain amount of time, because it just has that generic underneath your results. It'll have a generic thing saying you should retest. So, okay, these are the 10 that we narrowed it down to that are the most likely to cause problems. And if anyone is wanting me to focus on a specific area, you can drop that in the chat and make sure that I get the attention to that slide. All right. There's a couple things you're going to want to know before we go any further so that you understand what the terminology means. ELISA and PCR are the two tests that are typically used. ELISA tends to be maybe not as specific, not as good as the PCR. It's a kind of generic way to say that, but it's a lot less expensive. It's a lot faster. If you get a positive, or you think that a cow's positive and you get a negative and you want to retest, find a lab that'll do the PCR for that specific illness that you're concerned with. Every lab is different. So some will only do the ELISA for certain diseases. Some will only do the PCR. And sometimes they're going to ask for something specific as far as the samples. So usually you're going to be working with blood or with milk. The blood, sometimes they want that in what's going to be called a red top or a purple top. The purple top has an anticoagulant in it, and the red top does not. So you need to know what they need to be able to perform the test that they're going to be doing. Sometimes they'll charge you more if you don't send the right thing because it costs them more time to be able to do the testing. If you're talking about something or you're concerned about something that's in the udder specifically that is spreading through milk, that's when you're going to want to send in a milk sample. Anything that's specific to the udder would be like maybe mastitis, like staph A. We'll get to that at the very end. But that's where you're going to send in milk samples instead of blood because you want to know possibly even which quarter. So you may send in 4 milk samples, 1 from each quarter, and labeled very clearly so that the lab can tell you and you get the most out of the investment for testing. So that's what the different samples are in ELISA and PCR. Okay. Some basic biosecurity measures can go a really long way. Having farm shoes that you wear on your farm to do your chores, to go out, visit the cows, brush the cows, whatever you're going to do, that you don't wear to town, you don't wear to the fair, you don't wear to go visit your friends who've got farms, especially if they have chickens, because chickens tend to free range and it's everywhere. You're going to want to sterilize things. Sometimes bleach is enough, sometimes it isn't. There are special products that you can use. If you search for something, on Amazon or wherever that will kill parvo, that's probably going to be able to do anything that you need it to do on your homestead. Visitors and any service providers should have clean hands. They should be wearing clean clothes. They should not have come from the last farm doing AI breeding and say, ha, 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 look at me, I'm covered in poo from the last place, because you never know what's being spread through that. Your AI tech should know better, so should your vet. Anyone trimming hooves, that kind of thing, those are the ones that I seem to have a little more issue with, the cleanliness and what my cows are coming into contact with. And it can get a little scary. So you need to take measures to protect them and to protect yourself. That means maybe wearing boot covers, shoe covers, staying on the path. When I do have someone come to trim hooves, I keep them on the driveway. They don't go out into my pasture with their equipment. I don't even have them walk out and retrieve my cows. I do all of that to keep them specifically on my driveway. Anything that they might have brought in stays on the driveway. Testing, for most situations, once is never enough. And that really is scary because when you get that positive test, when you get that negative test, you think that you're home free, and that's not always the case. If you do happen to get a positive test, you want to retest that. They recommend 3 months. You may not be able to wait that long because it would be really stressful, I imagine. So retesting, always when you get a positive result, always I recommend that you retest. Mistakes can be made, or you may use a bad sample. You just don't really ever know. Maybe I have heard of situations where a sample got mixed up in the lab. That doesn't happen very often, but always retest. And that includes those clean tests too. And we'll get into that. Some of those diseases can be latent or they can be intermittent. So you may get a clean one and then a positive one and then a clean one again. So you really want to make sure that you're testing annually for a lot of these things. When you're purchasing AI straws, you also need to be aware that there are specific diseases listed here that can pass through that straw being frozen and thawed if the semen was infected. Some really old straws, if you get a hold of a bowl that's like 15, 20 years old, there was a while there where blue tongue was being spread through the straws because of the fluid that they add to make up the volume of the straw had been infected. So ask the person that you're buying straws from for the results for those things. Blue tongue, you're not going to find very often. I personally don't test for that, but when you buy old straws, I would do that. I have paid to have an old straw tested. It was like $125 before I used any of the other straws in the batch that I bought. If you've got questions about that for your specific situation, send me an email at admin@purebredminijerseys.com. So quarantine, when you bring in a new animal, you should have an area on your property that you can put them where they can be safe by themselves, that have access to food and water, but not access to any of your cattle. You don't want them to have any shared fence line. You don't want your dog going in and out, anything like that. You want to make sure that they are completely in quarantine, even going so far as to change your shoes before you walk into that area to muck out their stall, or change their water, give them their boots or any of that kind of stuff. Have a dedicated set of boots. You can just put it in a tote and keep it right there. It'll keep them dry. And then you can switch out really easily when you go in and out, and then retest that animal before you put them into the herd. So the stress of moving them can cause them to start showing more symptoms if they have been exposed to something and it was being kind of suppressed by their immune system. The stress of moving will make their immune system take a dip, and then those things will come up. So retesting 30 days later protects your cows before you move that new animal into your herd. Vaccines, I don't personally know a lot about vaccines, but they are a tool that you can use in your protocol. If you're going to be giving any sort of vaccine or any sort of medication at any time, you always want to check and make sure that you know the milk withholding, which that means that you're going to throw your milk out for a certain amount of time. So if you give a shot and it says it's a 30-day withholding, then that means for 30 days you're throwing your milk away, not putting it into your compost, ideally dumping it into like a pit that you dig and then cover up when that 30 days is over. You don't want any other animals or anyone getting into that because it could have antibiotics. It could have a live virus in it. Whatever that vaccine is could pass potentially. There is a sample biosecurity plan, and I'll make these slides available so you can use these links, but the address is there, so you could type it in if you want to see. It goes through and asks questions specifically, like in this situation, you could do this or this or this, and it gives you a plan to be able to just check the boxes and know what to be doing. And then there's the source there for this slide. Okay, so our first disease is TB, tuberculosis. And that's the one that I think the CDC is still pushing, that raw milk isn't safe because of the history of TB being spread through milk, through, those TB wards. Everybody is familiar with the stories of the coughing and the nastiness that TB is. So that's the fear. I think that we're taught growing up that raw milk is scary, it's bad. But really, TB honestly isn't much of an issue anymore because it is part of the federal eradication program. It's not gone, it's out there, but it's not very likely you're going to come into contact with this on your property. It can be spread through, of course, infected cattle. They can get infected at any age. If you inhale anything that has been aerosolized, say you're mucking a stall and that powdered manure comes up, typically TB is caught through like rodents that spread it through their feces, and then it gets on the counter, at a cabin that you rent or something, and then it gets on your food and that you ingest it that way. Typically, you'll be very aware that the animal is sick, not too long into them being sick, so you can test right away. There is not a cure for cattle, and they need to get a special permit because of TB being federally regulated to be able to go to slaughter. But my understanding is that meat can be utilized still. To test for that, the vet is going to have to do that test for you, and they just poke a needle just right underneath the tail of your cow. It's called the caudal fold. They'll come back 72 hours later, so you have to pay the vet to visit twice. And then they'll come and they'll feel underneath the tail. It has to be the same person who did that initial shot underneath the tail, and it does have to be almost exactly at 72 hours. If that test were to ever be positive, then it requires additional testing, additional quarantine, and then they get the federal government involved in that. Oh, and it is zoonotic, just to make sure that we point that out. And zoonotic means that it can spread to other animals and to people. Okay, bangs is the term used for a brucellosis infection or brucellosis shot. Brucellosis is a bacteria, and it is also part of that federal eradication program. There are still pockets of infected wildlife, but typically the United States is considered free, with the exception, I believe, of some animals right there around Yellowstone. That's the last I heard that there was any infection left in the United States. So it doesn't typically bother people. The vaccination that they offer now is not as dangerous as the previous one. You used to have to not handle your cattle basically because they would shed live virus, and now it's not a live virus. So it's not as scary, I guess, is the way to put that. It was really scary to initially have that vaccine because it was live and it was shedding. So now it's not as bad, but you need to understand that that brucellosis vaccine is not actually stopping your animal from becoming infected. The vaccine was intended to prevent the financial loss of losing the pregnancies for big beef herds, essentially, or dairy herds. So that stops the loss of pregnancy, but not the infection. And once your animal has had a vaccine, they can test positive, although they may not be. So that makes it a little tricky. Some states require it. I think more states are moving away from that. If you're ever going to export to Canada, they will not import animals that have the bangs vaccine because they can get false positives or false negatives. And they won't really know if that animal is infected, and they are clean up there, so they don't want this disease. Think that was everything about brucellosis. Okay, trichinosis is going around. It does go around on a regular basis. It is still out there. It is still something to be concerned about. It is one of those ones that I pointed out can live through being frozen and thawed and then inseminated. So AI straws are potentially a way that it could be spread. So you want to make sure that you're using straws from bulls that have been tested. It can be any animal of breeding age can be infected from a bull who passes it to a cow, then passes it to the next bull that she is live covered bred with, is typically how that is spread. It's a sexually transmitted disease. The test for that requires, I think it's a vet, because I've always had a vet do it before. And they have to actually go up into the sheath and get that pre-pubis fluid and pull that out. They need a certain amount of it. So the bull has to be secured to be able to get that, of course, and to not damage his reproductive system. And it has to be sent that same day to the lab so that they can test for trich. There is no treatment for it. So if your cattle are positive, I believe that it's not part of the eradication program, but I do believe that the vet and the federal government gets involved in that situation, is my understanding. Okay, this is to hammer home that the AI is a cleaner way to breed, a less dangerous way to breed, but it is not necessarily completely protecting your cow from getting infected. You do want to make sure that you're using clean straws from clean bulls that have been tested. And one of the things that was shocking to me is that facilities are not required to test the bull before they collect. So specifically the places that come to the farm and collect the bull on farm, they do not do any disease testing, and they don't require any disease testing. They're assuming those straws are for your personal use within the herd there that the bull is already part of. So there's no testing done on those. And that's very common in the mini Jersey world, that the straws are made that way. I've got straws from a couple of my bulls that way. Both Vanguard and Renegade were collected on farm. That's only done as conventional straws, not the heifer sorted straws. So heifer sorted are done through a facility, and I believe there is probably some testing behind that, is my experience. But you'll want to know, and you want to ask for testing. And anyone selling you straws should want to protect your herd and protect their own reputation. So it should not be considered rude at all for you to ask for disease testing to protect your herd.
Can I ask you a question on that, Lorinda?
Yes.
If you're, so would it make sense that you could assume that a virgin bull would be negative for that and then test at the point you're collecting, since you're already messing with him and restraining him and everything anyway?
That's my understanding, is
Mhm.
that that's one that is not passed like in utero and those kinds of things, that it is sexually transmitted. Um,
Mhm.
I would confirm that, of course, but that's my understanding, is that a virgin bull is going to be clean for trich. um, because he hasn't been able to be exposed. But guaranteeing that a bull is a virgin bull is difficult. They're doing everything in their power to work against that.
Right.
Okay, so BLV, it's a lot more scary to me than some of these other ones, because it is spread so easily. It's a virus. It's actually leukosis, which is a kind of a cancer, and it causes tumors pretty much all throughout the body. It can be in the eye, it can be almost anywhere. Typically, it's going to be in the lungs and around the heart, gastrointestinal. It causes a lot of issues. Um, they're not always obvious that they're as sick as they are. They can look fine and be shedding. Um, it can spread at any age. They have done some studies that found a link to breast cancer tissue in people, but they don't feel like there's enough evidence to be able to say that that's for sure. What really freaks me out about this one is that it's a type of leukosis, so it's like a cancer that is contagious. And I didn't know cancers could be contagious. I find that very scary. So there's a lot of this in the dairy herds. It's very common. It's one of the reasons animals are sent to auction from a dairy or from a beef herd. So it's one of those reasons why you want to avoid auction cattle. They could be exposed at the auction as well. That to diagnose it, they use a blood test because it is a blood cancer. One of the things I found that I didn't know before this was that animals may be infected early in life, when they're fairly young, and then test negative and actually start testing positive after a couple of years. I did not know that about BLV. So that's one of those reasons why you want to be doing that annual testing, is so that if there is anyone that comes positive, especially when you're establishing your herd and those animals weren't necessarily born on your property, you haven't had them for years, you want to do that annual testing. So if anything happens, you can catch it early and you can deal with it. There's not any treatment for BLV, and those animals are sent to be dispatched, but they cannot be processed. It's one of the things the USDA looks for at the processing plants, and those carcasses are condemned. They cannot be consumed. So this was a pretty bad one. BVD, when you think bovine viral diarrhea, you think that it's not, I mean, it's diarrhea, you're going to live. It's not that big a deal. We'll get over it. But this is to the extreme, to where they actually become severely sick. They can't keep enough fluids in. They lose their fertility. That's usually one of the first signs that the animals are sick. So those clinical signs are typically how they figure out that an animal is carrying this. They spread it. There's no cure. I believe you can eat the meat from this one if you cook it, but it's highly infectious. So any of those body fluids, the contaminated objects that were used on that cow, meaning anything used for breeding, artificial insemination guns. They say that it can spread by biting insects, although there's not a lot of proof of that. Even within a herd that's infected, the animals that are clean may still test clean and still be clean. So they don't think that biting insects are spreading it, but it is possible, is what my understanding is. It has happened, but it's not as likely. Like the flies that get in their eyes and that kind of thing. It can also be transmitted from a pregnant cow to her calf, and that is the worst situation, because that is an animal that becomes persistently infected. They consider that a virus factory. Everything I read about it says that that is the worst case scenario, when the cow is not known to have been infected with BVD. She delivers a calf, and the calf is very likely to have been be positive, and the calf will spread it. But their immune system is so used to it that they don't necessarily look sick. So another one of those situations where you have to test to know, because you don't find out until you start losing calves, you start losing pregnancies. Some of the older animals or some of the very young animals will get really sick with pneumonia and then you'll start losing parts of your herd. So those animals that improve and then don't die from it are the ones that are probably carrying it and spreading it. Yonis has always been one that I was really afraid of, but now that I understand more about it, it's not as scary as it was. What was scary to me is that you can buy a cow that tests clean. She looks great. She's doing great. And then 3, 4, 5 years down the road, suddenly she's sick. And it turns out that she was sick all along because Johne's bacteria will colonize in the intestine and lay there almost dormant for anywhere from 3 to 6 years. So you can have an animal that was clean, but isn't actually clean because they aren't shedding it. So the best test for this one is to use a fecal culture. If they've got any of that bacteria, typically that's where it's going to be found in the fecal culture. But if it's a very small amount, it hasn't fully colonized yet, the immune system's dealing with it and it's laying dormant, then you're not going to get a positive. If it's when they're really sick and it's already systemic, that the ELISA and the PCR start showing a positive result for it. So whenever you get a positive, that could be a false positive, or you think an animal truly does have Johne's, and you're going to want to go straight to the fecal. It's a lot more expensive. It's about $125 for fecal compared to about $8 for an ELISA or $25 maybe for a PCR. But it can spread through manure, milk, water. It can go through their feed if for some reason there was manure that got into the feed, that kind of situation. But it's those animals that are really young that have an immune system that's very immature that get sick. So that's why you see those dairies pull all those calves and keep them in a separate area away from the cows and give them colostrum that they know is clean or that has been pasteurized. It's because they're trying to get them away from any fecal matter that could be infected with one of these diseases like Johne's. If someone tells me that they always pull their calves and they always bottle feed their calves, to me, that's a red flag. That means that they suspect that there's something going on in their herd and they're trying to protect their calves from it. To me, that's what that says. So I consider that a red flag and I would test for sure. You can't necessarily test the calves because again, they're not going to be positive because it's laying dormant. So if you have the ability to test the dam, that's where you're going to get your answer. So if you're buying a heifer from somebody and the dam is still on the property, test the dam for Johne's. Don't bother to test the calf because you're probably not going to get any answers there unless the calf is over a year old. Definitely over 6 months, but possibly even over a year. And even then, you may not get any true answers. If there's older animals in the herd, you can even ask to test the dam and an older animal in the herd. For example, I have a couple cows that are 8 and 9 years old. They still test clean. And yes, I still test them because now I know for sure, and I can tell my buyers, and I know that my calves are clean and safe because we've got generations of testing. So that's how you have to handle that one because it is one that lays dormant. Okay, so this is more about that Johne's bacterium. It's referred to as MAP, the Mycobacterium avium subspecies paratuberculosis. The mouthful, right? They tested milk, and this was in the UK, right off the shelf, and they found MAP bacteria over that 18-month period. There was a lot of MAP in that, and there is a connection with Crohn's disease. If you're familiar with that one in people, there's a connection that is proving to be stronger all the time with all of the testing being done. And then there's new testing out that can test people for Crohn's and be able to determine the actual strain of MAP that they have. So that was really interesting to read about to understand how that research has been coming along. There is a Johne's.org, I believe is the address. This was a different website that I found this information on, but that Johne's website has a lot of information. They send out updates whenever new research comes out. I always find those fascinating. All right, Neospora This is where we're starting to get into some of those diseases that are not, maybe we're not as familiar with. They're not necessarily less common. We're just not as likely to test for them. So Neospora is a parasite. It's a protozoan parasite. It's spread by dogs, and this one has a crazy lifestyle. So you're going to want to click on one of those links there. Specifically, I believe that last one, the file there from the UK, had a very nice image graphic that explained how the life cycle worked. Dogs are the ones that can carry those infectious, I'm sure I don't know how to pronounce this word, oocytes. They're the ones that shed them that are able to infect cattle. But cattle cannot shed them. They can't, those parasites cannot complete their life cycle inside a cow. So cows are not infectious to each other, but a cow can be infectious to her calf. And if she is infected with Neospora, the chances are that her calf will be born infected. If she can even carry the pregnancy, because Neospora is very likely that she will not be able to ever carry a pregnancy. And if she does, that calf is going to be infected. It's a very high probability of that. They typically abort though, and they don't carry the pregnancy. They have a really hard time with fertility. So if you start seeing abortions from one specific cow, she doesn't carry her calf for very long. 3-4 months, she loses it. You get her bred again, she loses it again. You need to do some testing because that's a pretty sure sign that she's got a disease, something going on there that's infecting her calf, and that is not making it to term. So I think we explained that. So cattle do not infect each other. So if you have an infected cow in your herd, but you have another one that's clean, the one that's clean cannot be infected, even though they're living together. Okay. Mycoplasma is kind of along those same lines. It's not one that we typically test for. You can't, Armor will test with blood. You can test for Neospora. And in their mastitis panel, they have a mycoplasma test. You can test for mycoplasma with a milk sample. These are things that I believe we should be testing for personally, and I do test for them because they have such a widespread, in the United States, we have so many cases of them, but it's just not something that we really seem to talk about. It's not like that BLV, BVD, Yonis that we're all familiar with, but it's out there. And if you're educated, then you're aware that this is something that you want to make sure your cow is clean. So it's not going to infect the offspring specifically. So this will spread to cattle again of any age. It needs direct contact, like feeding contaminated milk to her calf, like colostrum. Don't borrow colostrum from your friends and feed it to your calves. If your cow drops dead, you want to make sure that you're getting colostrum that's been pasteurized. Unfortunately, because of this specific reason, is you can spread these things. It can spread through the air and through water. Antibiotics can be used in people, but it's really, really hard to be treated. So you just want to avoid getting it all together. There is a vaccine for this one, but the research that I found, I believe it's in that second link there at the extension, said that the vaccine requires 2 doses. So sometimes they won't get both of the doses like they need to for it to actually work. But then there were studies done that indicated that those illnesses in the vaccinated animals were actually worse than the unvaccinated, which makes it really hard to know what's the right choice. So you need to talk to your vet and find out what's going on in your area and if this is something you should be worried about. Okay, a lot of times you're going to hear, a lot of times you're going to hear, oh, I don't do that because I have a closed herd. I don't test, I don't vaccinate because I have a closed herd. But when you really start talking to them, a very well-known person that had a lot of cattle was advertising a closed herd and then posting pictures of the cute neighbor cows bumping noses across the fence. That's not a closed herd. So understanding that gives you the ability to protect yourself when you're buying and investing in cattle, to know what that means to be a closed herd. And if you want to maintain a closed herd, I did maintain a closed herd for about 8 years. And then this year I broke that closed herd and brought in a heifer from a very specific situation with a lot of understanding of what that meant and what it meant for the rest of my herd. So there, if you want to do something like that, feel free to contact me and I can help you with the steps to take to protect yourself as far as testing, questions to ask, things like that. Okay, so closed herd. That means no outside cattle are brought in. You are not buying any more cattle. All of the genetics, the cows on your property, everything's coming from within what you already have there. If your calf is stillborn, you don't just go out and buy a graft calf to put on your cow. It's cute, it's adorable, its mommy died and it needs a new mommy, and you can't bring it home if you're a closed herd. And that means for 3 full years. That's the minimum that is nationally recognized for a closed herd, at least 3 years. So when you decide you're going to break that closed herd, it's a very big deal. So understand what that means to be able to have that closed herd for 3+ years. Your current livestock should have all been tested clean prior to arriving on your property, and then again after, to make sure that any of those latent diseases are caught in case that got kicked up when they transported. No contact through fence line or through a stream or that kind of situation, no shared water sources with any other livestock or wildlife. And that can be a really difficult one if you have a stream running through your property, to understand that that means that the cows can't be in that area if there are deer coming through, elk, moose, whatever you may have. No borrowing colostrum from friends. I do freeze dry colostrum, and I will put the name of the cow and the date it was collected so that I can provide the tests for that cow up to that point for the person that needs the colostrum. That is clean colostrum because the cow is clean, but you need to prove that with disease testing if you're going to be sharing your colostrum with people who may need that. So labeling that with the date, you can provide the testing that you've done up to that point. It's actually just as safe, if not safer. There was a long thread in disease-free dairy cows on Facebook about how to source clean colostrum, even from purchasing. So it was interesting. If you want to get into that, that's where you can go find that. A grazing lease means that you may not have the only cattle on that property or that has been on that property. And then, of course, like we said, no shared water sources. So say you're shipping a cow across the United States and there's a calf in or another cow in the stall in the trailer next to them. You don't want that water to be shared between them, the same bucket given to one cow to the next. You want that wall in that trailer to go all the way to the ground so there's no feces coming through. It gets really tricky to try to protect your investment then. No visiting pets, and that includes no friends riding their horses to your property, because horses can spread diseases that are zoonotic. Dogs, we talked about how that can spread neospora. You don't want them coming onto your homestead ever, because that could bring diseases onto your property. No renting, borrowing, or buying a new bull. You need to have live cover done, because that again would mean that you're not a closed herd. If you choose to do these things, and you can make a decision, educated choice to do this, just be aware that means you're not a closed herd. New genetics would come from AI straws from disease-tested bulls only. Any animals that leave home for any reason do not come back to the property. That's a little bit harder. Say your vet says, I don't do farm calls, you have to bring the animal in. Well, then that means you're not closed. And that may mean that you need to go get vet care anyways and go ahead and let go of that closed herd and restart your 3-year clock. That means no showing livestock at the county fair for 4-H, because if they come back home, then you're not closed anymore. Biosecurity measures should be taken to disinfect shoes, your own shoes, anybody else's shoes that's visiting. Clean hands is always a good idea. Any equipment that's used, any buckets or anything like that. If you find a great deal at a garage sale, somebody has some feeders or a round bale feeder or something like that, you want to sterilize it. We did pick up a used squeeze chute a few years ago, and it actually sat out in the sun at the highest point open in the field that the cows were fenced out of, and it sat like that for a year out in the sun, in the winter, in the snow, in the cold, and the below freezing temperatures before I was comfortable even using it. because it had been used previously. So we hosed it down and we left it. We just let it sit there for a year to go through all of that process. Uh, no lending or borrowing trailers. And that's the same kind of thing, that it's really hard to get sun on the inside of a trailer. And UV is a great way to sterilize a lot of these diseases. You don't want to lend your trailer out to somebody to haul a cow or any livestock, honestly, because it could become infected. And then you want to make sure that you limit your guests to the areas where cattle are never present. And that's where we talked about keeping them on the driveway. I just explained to them that, stay on the gravel. You can park your car anywhere on the gravel. If they're going to go out into the field with the cattle, then we're going to wash their boots. I have those plastic fake grass scrubby mats that you have maybe like at the front door of grandma's house, kind of a situation. One of those thrown at the bottom of a tote with some bleach water or some vet sterilizing fluid. They can scrub their boots off really well in that situation. If you have to have visitors on a regular basis, or you're having a special event, set up a little boot station to get everybody's shoes cleaned. It works really well. Okay, back to diseases. Q fever is less common, but it is not eradicated. And I actually know somebody who got infected when she bought cows. It's a bacteria, so it tends to be pretty contagious, easy to spread. It spreads through a lot of different ways: feces, milk, of course, urine. People can become infected by breathing that dust, like from manure, that kind of thing. Goats and sheep are the most common carriers. So if you know someone that has goats or sheep in with their cows, and you're buying a calf from them or a cow from them, or even just selling to them, maybe you want to ask for testing on those animals that are in sharing a pasture, because they could be carrying and shedding, and the calf that you're buying or the animal you're buying may not be infected yet. So that's, again, one of those situations where if you test the other animals, it may be the better clue as to what's going on to protect yourself. Common symptoms are not feeling good. You feel like you have the flu. You feel like you're run down. You kind of never really feel very hungry. You're just not feeling good, kind of a situation. And it's really hard to diagnose because it's so not common that the doctors don't typically think about it. So you may need to be aware, if you hear somebody that has these kinds of symptoms, like the flu that never goes away, it could be Q fever. Yep, most people will recover, but those who do start showing those symptoms, it could take a long time for them to get better. Years of doxycycline is the treatment. It's better to just avoid it altogether. Okay, staph A is another one of those ones that's scary, and it's very common. And I'm sure that you've heard of cattle that have staph A. There are some people that feel like you can safely have staph positive animals in your herd and just mitigate it by working around it, maybe milking them last. But staph is opportunistic. It likes warm, wet environments, which is exactly what the udder provides. It's warm and it's moist, and staph will spread from one quarter to the next. So it's pretty scary how quickly it can spread through a whole herd. It's not something to mess around with because it will spread so quickly. It is a highly contagious pathogen. It will go up the teat canal and infect the quarter. Sometimes the animal is able to wall it off, is how the terminology is, meaning that that's not necessarily spreading, but it's intermittent. It's one of those things that'll come and go. So she may wall it off. It seems like things are better. It seems like she's doing good. And then something happens. You've got a hot summer, or you have a really cold winter, and just something as simple as that, and she goes down again, and she's got mastitis, and you're fighting it for months until it walls off, or it spreads, and it's just a big disaster. So testing the milk is really important. If you're buying an animal that is in milk, I strongly recommend that you test the milk. Do that infectious 3 panel. That's going to have staph A in it. Staph aureus is the actual name of it. There is a treatment for people that have staph A, and staph is one of those things that it's in the hospitals. It spreads really common through the hospitals. but it's kind of around all the time. We're all exposed to it on a regular basis. The reason that it's scary for us is because those cattle provide exactly what the staff needs to flourish in their udder. So those flare-ups and the ability to spread is very likely, especially if you're using a milking machine, it's going to spread from one cow to the next or from one quarter to the next. Okay, so I wanted to make this little graphic to kind of give you an idea about the kinds of samples that you may need or that you're asked to collect when you have an animal that you're trying to test, whether it's to prove that she's clean or and to establish that testing routine, or if it's an animal that you're concerned may be sick. So the different diseases that we covered are all listed there, and whether it's a milk, blood, or if there's something else that they need to do, and then the kinds of tests that are available. So you need to understand, though, that it depends on the lab that you're working with. The lab may only offer PCR for certain illnesses or may only offer ELISA for certain illnesses. So that's fine. But if you do get what you think is a false negative or you get a positive, you want to retest, and you may even want to switch labs. If that's the case and it was an ELISA test, then do a PCR next time. Unless it's Yoni's, and then you're going to do a fecal. Okay. And all this medical terminology is really not my strong suit. What to do when you get a positive test. Because I help so many people, I've had a lot of people contact me asking, what do I do now? I have a positive cow for this, or I have a friend that has a positive cow for this, and I want to help them, and I don't know what to do. So the first thing you need to do is get your vet involved. Anytime you're dealing with something that might be infectious, you want to figure out and use them. That's what they're there for. Figure out how to protect the rest of the animals, whether it's her offspring or the other animals in your herd, or even your own family and your children. So you're usually going to be told to remove clean animals to clean pasture that is not hasn't been raised recently, hasn't had that positive animal on it recently, and then retest them at a later date to confirm that they are still clean. And then any cows that you know are clean, you want to make sure that they're calving on clean ground, so that there's no chance that any dirt gets stirred up and infects them or their calf. And then you have to deal with mitigating the issue on your property, which may mean, again, the soil. It could actually be in your soil, and when the soil gets stirred up from chicken scratching or you cleaning it or cleaning the feces out, scraping it, or even turning it into a garden, you can get infections that way. So infected feces and the ground need time for the bacteria, virus, or parasites to die out. Different ones take different amounts of time. But typically, you're going to have at least a year of not using that specific area, which is really difficult if in your situation, it's your barn, maybe your stalls that got infected, that have had the cow in it, or you've got, just one pasture and you have a positive cow. You may need to have no cows for at least a year to make sure that the next animal you bring on is going to be safe on that property. Warm areas are going to have a harder time to be able to eradicate these things because most of the time they like the warmth. They typically don't like really cold climates. Any infected animals that are carrying a disease, you're going to want to calve them on areas that you already know are potentially infected so that you don't spread that any further across your property. Burning the tissue, digging a big pit and burying it, putting rocks on top of it so you don't have any wild animals or your farm dogs digging it up. And that includes anything like the amniotic fluid or blood. If you're going to process an animal that isn't positive, you want to bleed that animal to a place where you can dispose of the blood safely. You want to remove the calf and feed them clean colostrum and pray that you have a calf that's not infected. A lot of these things will pass to the calf, but sometimes it's as little as a 30% chance. Sometimes it's a 70% chance, depending on the disease. And then treat that calf's manure and any birthing matter as biohazard. So you're again going to destroy it with fire or burying it or doing whatever you can to get it far away. That does not mean that you put it in your compost pile. This isn't a situation where you can just compost it. It needs to be treated as biohazard So not handling it with bare hands, that kind of situation. And then test those calves. Typically they say 6 months. But Sarah Milsedic brought to my attention that her vet recommends 12 months. So you may want to test more than once. Because those maternal antibodies from the colostrum and the milk that the calf has been getting, especially a heifer that you're letting nurse maybe a little longer, you would want them to have that retest at that 1 year mark. Definitely before breeding, you want to make sure that that heifer is clean. And then to hard call, and this is typically a nice way of saying that you're going to put the animal down, you're going to dispose of it, you're going to kill it. This is one of the hardest things you may ever have to face, to have to make that decision that your animal needs to be destroyed to protect your family, the rest of the herd, your property. It's not something to be taken lightly. So if you do get a positive, you want to retest because you can't take this decision back. I know a lot of times I've actually been contacted with somebody that had a positive, they put the animal down. And then there have been a few situations where they got contacted from the lab at a later date and it was a mistake and the animal may not have been sick. I've actually heard that story more than once. So always check again because you can't take it back. So that's why that first step to remove those clean animals gives you the time to retest the animal that was positive and see if they actually are positive. Let's see. Yep. I think we've covered all of that. Some diseases, they say you can cook the meat and it's still safe. It depends on the disease itself. I found a really nice risk assessment management plan there for yonis. And if that works for yonis, it should work for any other infectious disease. Okay, so if you have that positive test and you've got something on your property and you're trying to figure out what to do, those are the steps you go through before, but this slide, this is how long it's going to take you until your area is clean. There's a lot of different sources used for these. They're listed on the previous pages. Some things don't take very long to get rid of. Some things take a really long time. So we kind of broke it down there. Like trick cannot survive outside the host, but if it's suspended in nitrogen and frozen, then it could survive being thawed and then put into the next host, into a cow. BLD was one of those ones where the milk products should not be fed to calves and the meat should not even be consumed. Yonis can live in the soil, it said, for as much as a year. It really likes acidic soils and it can live through heat and cold and dry. So it needs time really for it to break down and be destroyed. But Neospora, even after, like we talked about how the dog spreads it. So the dog spreads it in its manure, its feces break down. They still found Neospora in that area where the feces have broken down in some testing that they did. So just because the feces is gone, it's decomposed, does not mean that that has completely been eradicated. It needs to have enough time, or you need to go through a nice hard winter. I did find some research that said a 3-day freeze was enough to kill it. The other thing I found that I had not been familiar with is that it is thought that the dogs only shed those oocytes for 2 to 3 weeks, 3 to 9 days after they are infected. So if you're bringing a livestock guardian dog on, you want to check and see if they have antibodies for Neospora, because it could mean that they were infected previously. It shouldn't mean that they're still infectious now, but that was an older study. So it's probably best to test. And I don't think it's very terribly expensive, under $50 for sure, which is a lot less than the value of our cows. Q fever was one that can live for a really long time. Tetanus is not on this list, but tetanus, they found tetanus that could live as long as 50 years. The deal with that one is it cannot be exposed to oxygen, and it has to be, so that's where they say you step on a nail. It gets deep inside, so there's no oxygen, and it has to make contact with your blood to get into your bloodstream for tetanus. So, it has to come from feces. It has to be something sharp. The stepping on a nail in the backyard is probably not going to be scary unless you're on a homestead that had cattle 50 years ago. So understanding these things, understanding what really makes the disease work, that those ones that ultraviolet can break it down, the things that need a certain situation to survive or to spread should help you be more comfortable with what the dangers are on your property and with bringing in new livestock. Does anyone have any questions now that we've reached the end? That's a lot of information. Any questions? You'll have to unmute yourself.
So, Lorinda, I had a question on yonis. I want to make sure I understand this correctly.
Okay.
If the calf, let's say, was like a carrier, but they're not showing any signs of the disease, are they not spreading it, or can they still spread it even if it's like lying dormant? I guess my
So,
question is, when can it be spread?
right. Yonis is one
Yeah.
of those ones that can be intermittent.
Okay.
So the immune system is trying to fight it, and the immune system can almost even get used to living with it in the intestine.
Okay.
So it'll be dormant for a little while, and then there'll be a flare up, and then it'll be dormant for a little while, and then there'll be a flare up. Um, so you may not see the full effects to where the animal actually appears sick
Okay.
for quite some time. There's a pretty famous case from a very public YouTube channel that they not all their cows were clean. They had tested them when they bought them.
Hmm.
When she went to sell one of her cows, it tested positive because the buyer knew to ask for testing. And they were shocked. Everybody was shocked that this animal was sick because she didn't look sick. But at that point, she had a couple, at least two calves. So had she been in a flare up when she was pregnant? We don't know because she wasn't ever retested. So it
Hmm.
wasn't until, 4 years later or so when they retested the heifer that they bought clean that she was positive. So it's really hard to say. That's why you want to retest. And that's part of,
Okay.
I find Yoni so scary. But knowing the situation that the heifer is coming from and knowing that the dam is clean can really help to mitigate any issues of bringing an animal onto your property if you have the ability to test the dam.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks.
Just a
Yeah.
follow-up question on that too, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
Once that dam is like over a certain number of years old or wherever she starts, like how am I trying to I'm trying to think like would she reach a point where she would stay positive and it wouldn't be intermittent anymore?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
it's very likely that she would stay positive eventually as she ages, and that's why that tends to flare up as they age. The immune system can be more stressed out by things like weather and calving. Even being at peak production can be enough to stress it out, and they will very often at that point become positive more consistently, and there may not be a dormant period anymore. That everybody's questions? All right. Well, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you learned something new today.